Starting on March 30th, PBS and WGBY will bring you the first episode of Cancer, the Emperor of All Maladies. It is the latest production from the team of documentary filmmakers headed by Ken Burns, and it is based on the book, The Emperor of All Maladies, a Biography of Cancer, written by Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee. A couple of years back, Dr. Mukherjee was in Western Massachusetts to address the Springfield Public Forum, and we taped an interview with him at the Springfield Marriott Hotel. Now, as we prepare for the Ken Burns documentary, we want to bring you this encore presentation of our talk with Dr. Mukherjee about the Emperor of All Maladies.
Patients would ask me over and over again, where are we in the war on cancer? How did we get here, and what happens next? So my book is really an attempt to demystify cancer, to explain where we are and what happens next, and look a little bit at the future. But ultimately it was driven by these questions, by a patient's question, which is, to understand the essence of what cancer is and how we got here and what happens next.
I'm fascinated by the title you and I assume your publishers chose, The Emperor of All Maladies, a biography, not a history, a biography of cancer. And you do treat cancer very much as if it were a person.
Well, I was careful not to over-personify cancer. I mean, obviously cancer is an illness. Actually, cancer is not one disease, but many diseases. So I was careful not to over-personify it, but that said, the subtitle biography came quite late in the writing of the book. And really it refers to the idea, which I think is a central idea in the book, is the idea of drawing a portrait over time. We look at cancer in 1750, in 1850, in 1950, and then 2050. And how does that portrait change? How does that evolve? So in that sense, there is this biographical element to it in which you're describing the evolution of the same idea. In a human being, it would be the same human being. But in the case of illness, it's a cultural idea, a social idea, a biological idea, and you're moving it through time. And hence the title, Biography of Cancer.
You cite the first known written reference from about, I believe, 4,500 years or so ago, an Egyptian reference to cancer. Fascinating that you were able to even find that and
right.
Make something of it.
Well, we don't, the word cancer doesn't exist in 2500 BC. But that said, the case description is remarkably similar to what we might consider a contemporary case of breast cancer. Now, there are many mysteries in that case. This is a crumbling yellow papyrus that comes to us from 2500 BC, was retranscribed in around 1500 BC. It's an ancient document. We don't know if it's cancer, but it sure sounds a lot like cancer, particularly breast cancer.
Correct me if I'm wrong, I believe I read that you spent about 10 years from start to finish.
7 years, yes.
7 years, excuse me, on this book. An amazing amount of time. You just immersed yourself in it. But tell me about the research. The research clearly was international and in great depth.
What goes into the book, what went into the book is very diverse. They range from personal one-on-one interviews with scientists, but also patients, all the way to actually visiting a site, to looking up tens of thousands of papers, primary papers, scientific papers on cancer, and looking up literature, writings, patient writings. So a huge different variety of sources. But the most important piece of all of this is that I had to discover the history myself. And by that I mean that I couldn't take a second person's account of it. If it meant, for instance, I would travel to certain locations to experience those locations myself in order to construct the story. And that experience, I think, was what ultimately sort of brought this book together.
There's a lot of Massachusetts in the book. You profile one particular patient that you became quite close to. And I'm fascinated by the story of Sydney Farber, who you call the father of modern chemotherapy. And you tell his really kind of unusual story of how he worked.
Absolutely. Sydney Farber was a pathologist, and usually pathologists don't treat patients. They diagnose diseases. They look in their microscopes and look at tissues and cells. But Sydney Farber was more than a pathologist. Working in Boston in the 1950s, he began to wonder whether he could treat a particularly lethal, fatal version of cancer called acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And he actually was, in order to do so, began to use chemicals to treat cancer and is considered one of the fathers of modern chemotherapy. But even more than that, more than just inventing chemotherapy or helping invent chemotherapy with the help of other people, Farber also launched the War on Cancer in collaboration with Mary Lasker. And it's this second contribution that particularly interested me. How does one convert? How does Farber transform his own life from being a scientist in a laboratory to becoming this public figure, this lobbyist, this advocate for cancer research nationally and internationally? And that's the story that really is sort of the central story in the book.
In what I found very interesting, toward the end of the book, you take one presumed cancer patient, the Queen Atossa, ancient Persia, who apparently had breast cancer. I don't think it's quite certain.
Yes,
at
it's
that
not
time,
certain.
500 BC. And you bring her through the ages. What would have happened had she lived a little earlier than she did and up through the centuries? Very interesting. What led you to do that?
Well, you know, I had written the book, I'd almost finished the book, and I was looking for a summary. I mean, how does one summarize this entire swath of history? And it seemed to me that, well, the best way to summarize was to, again, do what physicians do, is to focus on a single case. And in this case, of course, there wasn't a single case. I mean, no one lives for 4,000 years in order to summarize the amazing developments that have happened in breast cancer. So what I did in the end of the book was to perform a kind of thought experiment. Physicists famously do this kind of experiment in which they don't really have someone to actually do the experiment, but they imagine an experiment and they sort of walk you through in time. And so I imagined her as a kind of Atossa, as a kind of experiment. I said, well, you know, if you take the same woman and you give her breast cancer in 500 BC or in, you know, 500 AD, or in 1500 AD, and so forth, and walk her through time and ask the question every century, every 5 centuries, ask the question, well, what happens to her? What happens to the same woman? And if you do this exercise, it's a kind of a mental exercise. If you do the exercise, you all of a sudden realize that the changes have been enormous. What seemed like small little changes, iterative changes, begin to add up and change, you know, as I point out in the book, Atossa, if she was diagnosed at 47, in 500 BC, may have had some kind of crude surgery, may not have had surgery, and she would have died of breast cancer. In 2011, that whole spectrum is transformed. She has surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, targeted therapy, all these things. Her children are screened, her daughters are screened, and may be protected from having breast cancer ever in their lifetime. I mean, what a transformation in just that illness, breast cancer, across the span of about 2,000 years, pardon me.
There are, as you point out, so many different kinds of cancer, so many ways it can mutate and become immune to treatments and defy treatment. Can you even imagine, I'm mimicking the patients you said who really led you to the book in a way, but a time when a cure will really be found for all cancers, or will it be more of a treatment and management of this disease?
I'm pretty confident that's going to be a treatment and management situation for cancer. First of all, I doubt that we will ever find a cure for all cancers. This was an idea very popular in the 1970s, that there would be, it was called the penicillin for cancer. Just like penicillin cures many forms of infectious diseases, people thought you could, you know, use a similar kind of magical reagent, magic bullet against all cancers. I strongly doubt that that will happen. I suspect that we will bite away at this problem piece by piece. Breast cancer will be treated with a different series of medicines, brain cancers with a different series of medicines, surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, all of these combined together. And in many cases, we'll never be able to cure the cancer altogether, but we'll be able to transform the cancer into a chronic disease. Now, I mean, look at diabetes. That's a great example. I mean, before the discovery of insulin, the medicine that we use primarily to treat diabetes, although there are other medicines, diabetes was often a fatal disease. Now we have thousands, hundreds of thousands of men and women living with diabetes, but not dying of diabetes, but living with diabetes. Look at the case of chronic heart disease. So there are many examples in which the conversion of an illness from acute and lethal to chronic and non-lethal have been very important, just as important as curing them outright.
Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee, thank you for your time, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.